The question of parts and wholes is one of the classic questions of philosophy and metaphysics, and it remains a serious problem in modern understanding of reality, even though it's not even articulated as such anymore, usually in a scientific context. Because the scientific context essentially has a background assumption, or had it at least, a vision of reality that was essentially all reducible. So material organization of things is always created of parts throughout the created world, and that ultimately these parts, the only wholes, are the ultimate minimal structures that form the larger system. So, okay, simple point, like string theory was an attempt, for example, to delineate the only wholes are these strings, and the rest of the world is just made of these parts that ultimately form large reality. But ultimately, it's reducible to these strings. That's string theory for you, in a nutshell. But the problem of parts and wholes, of course, is actually much deeper than that. And the reason we can know it's much deeper than that is consciousness. Consciousness is a whole. It's called the unity of consciousness is a central part of any theory of consciousness. Consciousness always comes in complete wholes. And yet, of course, it's made of parts. It's made of the material organization of the world like everything else is. So how can you have wholes and parts? It is by analyzing the question of wholes and parts specifically in terms of consciousness that the solution to the problem of parts and wholes becomes apparent. And here we come again to the integrated information theory of technology. And I'm kind of repeating some of the themes I had mentioned earlier, but they're important, and you can see how they relate to parts and wholes. According to the integrated information theory of consciousness, and also it's a causal theory, the only things that are wholes are systems that are independently causally efficacious. That by looking at the causal power of a thing, one can determine whether or not it is a whole or a part. What does this mean? Okay. Let's imagine a photodiode. This is the example that Giulio Tononi gives in his papers. Let's imagine the example of a photodiode, which can detect light and dark, and therefore generates one bit of information. This or not this. Okay, that's all it does. It generates one bit of information. So it is a single whole determining a maximally minimal, a minimal amount of information, a minimal information state. Okay. Now we get to a camera. And it would seem to be that this camera as a whole then is generating vastly more amounts of information, because it can take, it basically is millions of little photodiodes put together that can create almost any picture, right? So this would be a whole that would be so much more than the parts. No. This is the key point. What we perceive as a whole is actually nothing but a collection of independent photodiodes. And that as the system as a whole has no intrinsic existence. It has no phi value. What is a phi value? I actually haven't mentioned this before. Phi is the term that Tononi gives for the value of consciousness of a thing, the amount of bits that a system generates when it reduces uncertainty about itself based on the structure of its internal wiring. Oh, there it is. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? There it is. Phi. Wow, you can't see it. There we are, phi. The phi value of a thing, that took longer than I thought. The phi value of a thing is the amount of bits a system states that it's eliminating when it reduces uncertainty about itself. So a photodiode generates one bit of information, has a phi value of 1. Okay. The photodiode and the camera are in the same predicament in the sense that the camera is nothing but a collection of photodiodes that are not communicating with each other. There's no intrinsic being there. And therefore there's no intrinsic causal power. Whatever causal power that it has is manufactured by our ability to put the pieces together in order for it to give us information that we want, but there's no information intrinsic to the system itself for itself. There's no single phi value there. There's no whole, only parts. Now, how deep does this go? I was reading over some traditional scholastic and Aristotelian points of views about parts and wholes, and there's a deep faith in scholasticism that our consciousness picks up the basic objective parts and whole structure of reality, such that, you know, when I detect when I see an apple, there's a real whole there of the apple that's truly not reducible to the parts. And whether or not that's the case or not is a bit mysterious, how our consciousness actually picks up the parts and wholes of the world. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that that faith that consciousness is a correct detector of parts and wholes is just not true. It's just not really something we can sustain given what we know about the world now. Because now we actually have a determinate evaluation that we can give about whether or not something is a part or a whole. And so when we look at the apple, the question of whether it's a whole is simple. Does the apple somehow intrinsically have a phi value? Are there parts there that come together in a wiring structure such that the apple is really real in and of itself? Or is it merely real? Actually real versus merely real. My guess is that most things in the world are merely real, and that we do have some ability to detect the actually real through what we know about ourselves and how our wiring structure works, and how the fact that we have a brain that can generate a whole, and therefore we can then look at the world and see that through animals who have similar wiring structures, and perhaps even, you know, root systems maybe in forests or something, rainforests, maybe there is a sense of a wiring structure there. On one hand, it's going to be weirder than we think, that the world is actually made of wholes that are acting at radically different time scales and are just totally unperceptible to us. And on the other hand, that what we actually perceive as being concrete objects in the world are, for the most part, not wholes. They're constructions of our operating system in order to help us navigate causation, a causal reality that's far wilder than we can possibly imagine. And of course, understanding the dynamic relationship between what's actually there causally and then what we perceive to be there is probably one of the most, I mean, that's the kind of information that you receive in the beatific vision. That's the kind of information that God has, and how he's organized everything to reflect everything perfectly. But what's actually there in terms of the consciousnesses and the actual causal powers is somewhat mysterious. Nonetheless, the association then of all real causation with consciousness is so important. I mean, it does change things. All actual happenings are conscious to a certain extent. All actual happenings are conscious. Insofar as they're not conscious, they're happening within a consciousness perceiving something, like we do with the camera. I mean, the camera is giving us a totality of information, but the information it's giving us is only a totality in our minds. It's not in the camera. The wholes of the world are conscious states, because the wholes of the world are integrated causal mechanisms that are being perturbed in a certain way. Parts and wholes. Science has been obsessed with parts now for 300 years, and the time is up. We must return to wholes, but we cannot return to the wholes of traditional, of simply traditional Aristotelian scholastic understanding. We can use the ideas of Aristotelian scholastic understanding because they're more nuanced about wholes than modern modern thinking and modern philosophy, but nonetheless we have to get rigorous about what's really there in terms of wholes and in terms of integrated wiring structures. And if we could really see what it was, it would just be a two-dimensional sphere of wiring that generates n-dimensional geometry of conscious states that work together causally, in a sense outside space and time, but through space and time as a operating system of meaning. And that's kind of the best we can get at this point until more is, revealed to us and we figure out more. But we have a conceptual apparatus now and tools that we can use to really get our sense of parts and wholes together. Okay, thanks very much, guys.